If you work in crawl spaces, you already know this industry has some very strong opinions. Encapsulation versus ventilation, sealed crawl spaces versus vented crawl spaces. If you ask 10 contractors what the right solution is, you might get 10 different answers. So today we're talking with someone who has spent years studying crawl space environments and helping contractors manage them in a completely different way. This one might challenge a few assumptions, so grab your popcorn. Welcome to the Contractor's Edge, the show where we break down the tips, tools, and tactics that you need to grow your home service business. Whether you're in a truck or at the office, we're here to give you the edge you need to win. I'm Mike Stiers.
And I'm Anthony Brown.
Today's episode might stir the pot a little bit. Those listeners that are familiar with the crawl space repair industry know that building science has always been a controversial topic. Our goal here at the Contractor's Edge is not take sides in those debates. Our job is to bring smart people into the conversation so contractors like you can hear different perspectives, understand the science behind the decisions being made, and ultimately build better businesses. Today, we're joined by Myriam Breedlove, the owner of Atmox. Atmox has been working on crawl space ventilation technology since the 90s and focusing on managing crawl space environments through ventilation, circulation, and humidity control. This conversation is about crawl space science, some of the myths that exist in the industry, and how contractors might be leaving money on the table when it comes to crawl space solutions.
All right, now before we jump in, let me share a little bit about Miriam. Miriam Breedlove is the president and owner of Atmox and an experienced business leader with more than 25 years of experience in entrepreneurship, finance, and strategic business development. She leads the development of innovative moisture control solutions designed to improve crawl space environments and protect the structural integrity and health of homes. Her path into the industry is a little different than most people working under houses today. Miriam actually began her career in investment banking before transitioning into entrepreneurship after being inspired by a business school professor to leave what she calls Wall Street for Main Street. She purchased her first business before turning 30 and has been building companies ever since. She earned her MBA from Northwestern University's Kellogg School of Management after completing her undergraduate at Duke University, bringing a combination of analytical business strategy and hands-on entrepreneurial experience to the companies she leads. Today, she works with contractors across the country, helping them better understand crawl space environments, moisture management, and technologies available to control those conditions. Miriam, welcome to the Contractor's Edge.
Hi, Anthony. Hi, Mike. It's great to be here.
Yeah, great to have you. I know we've had some conversations, kind of leading up to this and meeting you at the conferences. Had a great conversation at World of Concrete, and Anthony and I are like, oh my gosh, we have to get Miriam on. I absolutely love, your chain of thought, the way that you're looking at things. And we felt like, hey, this is perfect for our listeners as well. So how did you get into the crawl space industry?
Yeah.
So, the bio that you just read sort of made it sound like I had a completely different path, which, my first decade of work experience was certainly different. But I ended up in this industry for the same reason as many, family. My father and grandfather were the inventors of the first system. And I think that actually makes me not unique at all. Like there are so many multi-generational family businesses in this home services industry that I think I got into it for the same way most and many listeners probably did as well.
No, that makes sense. We do find that a lot, and I actually like that. And I think homeowners do too, because the home is a family thing, and so
Right.
when you have the business structured the same way, I think it does lend to building a little bit of trust there. So I think that's great. I will say, your intro was difficult. You have quite a dense background there. So kudos to you.
Sure. And I was very fortunate to have many of those experiences. So I'm very, very, very pleased at what I got to do early on it.
Now, the company actually started with your father and grandfather, like you were just saying, and they were experimenting with ventilation technology. What were those early days like?
Yeah. So I have to give a little bit of background for this to make sense. So as we mentioned, my father and grandfather were the original inventors. So keep in mind, they did this they were retired / semi-retired in that they were in their 50s and 80s at this point in time. Like this was a late stage hobby for them in many ways. So to give a little bit more background, my grandfather actually lived in Switzerland, and he was working with engineering students on wine cellar technology, like how to cool and ventilate wine cellars. At the same time, now we're in the late 90s, my father lived in Gastonia, North Carolina, a Charlotte, North Carolina suburb where I grew up. His neighbor had major termite damage. And the contractor next door was like, well, Thomas, your house is next. Like there's really no difference between your house and that one. You're probably going to have the same problem. So in the late 90s, no one was really doing anything in crawl spaces yet. And so somehow in the conversation between the two of them, they were like, well, wait, what you're doing with the wine cellars might actually have application in the crawl space. And that's actually how the technology started. So I always laugh when people say, like, well, how did the company start? It really became a product in some ways before it became a company. But that's really kind of the original background of how they started, kind of got into it by sort of sheer coincidence, by those two things kind of happening simultaneously.
That's a really cool and unique story, actually.
So it's an oddball one, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, that is pretty interesting. So how did we get into, Atmox? Like what was your dad doing in that?
Yeah. So early on, remember, he's like close to retirement. So this is like a hobby, and he'd been in large business. He did everything himself, like everything. Like he was in his garage making the product. He would go out and try to sell it to somebody. Then he would be like, I'll be back to install it. A year later, he was servicing it. Like he was building a website. Like he was doing, it was a one-man show. And then as he grew a little bit, he started recruiting all these buddies. Like, I mean, he literally had like the guy down the street with the garage making fans. Like it was like a little entourage of guys that were kind of, kind of all playing around with this. But he really was doing everything, which allowed him to sort of further tweak and improve the product. Every time he would learn something new, he would go out and install it and go, oh, what if we did this? Or I'm seeing this. So it was a sort of a constant evolution of product in those early days of really tweaking and adjusting.
That's really
Yeah.
cool.
So V1000.
Yeah.
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 Now, when you stepped into ownership, what were some of the biggest challenges transitioning the business forward?
Sure. So I probably came in around 10 years into the product where he had, kind of gotten a little bit further along in sort of building a company around it on a small scale. It was still, for the most part, very Charlotte based. He was selling products, nationally, because at this point websites have kind of started and he's getting noticed in other places. It's hard to remember what that was like 20 years ago. We kind of forget that. So at that time, when he was still doing everything, that was sort of the initial start of helping with local install and service. For me, as we got into it, it took us really decades to make this transition, but the recognition was, well, wait a second, we can't do all of these things well. We can't be sales and service and install and product development and later a distributor of other products. Like this is too many different things. And also, you can't grow if you're competing against your potential customers, right? You can't, on one hand, be the installer and try to sell your products to another installer. We actually had that happen for a little while. It was a problem. It was a real problem. So really the transition was a recognition of what do we do best? And that was product development, manufacturing of the product, and slowly shedding all those other pieces. I mean, it took us decades, really, of this evolution to get out. And I think that's actually a small business trap that a lot of people have. You're like, oh, but we could do this. And you see some other money on the side and you get into it and you're like, well, we can add this other portion. And then once you've got it, it's hard to get back out. One, you've started making commitments of service plans or something like that, or you're a small business and you're afraid to let go of that cash flow. So you really sometimes have to recognize, and we have to do this over and over again. You have to go backwards in order to go forwards. And that's difficult for small businesses to do. You really fall into that trap. So I guess my word of advice is think carefully before you add on something, a new business line, because you need to make sure it's part of your core, what you do well. Otherwise, you're going to have a hard time getting back out of it. So it was really a long evolution. I mean, I wouldn't say it was easzy. It took a while to kind of get from where we started to where we are now.
Yeah,
That's
I understand what it's like when you start to spread yourself too thin. I had worked for, at the time with the basement doctor,
Yeah.
we were great at foundation repair, waterproofing, crawl space repair, and then little weird things would pop in and, all of a sudden we're doing attic insulation. And I'm going to tell you, as the marketing guy that had to get up into the attic with guys that typically work in a crawl space
Yeah.
or basement, I mean, we had roofing nails in our backs. We were hitting our head on things. One of the guys dropped through, put his legs through
Oh, no.
the ceiling, and we were like, yeah, maybe this isn't a good idea. So I understand you're like, hey, this is money. We could potentially get this. But yeah, definitely a way to spread your business too
Right.
thin.
It's a business trap that it's easy to fall into.
Yep.
Yeah. We talk
Well,
about that sometimes too with expanding on territory. Like
Mhm.
Yeah.
sometimes people just get a pipe dream in their head. It's like, I always wanted to be in this one particular market, and they will spread themselves very thin trying to make that market work. And yeah, one of those
Yeah.
traps.
Nothing like the extra windshield time.
Absolutely.
All right. Well, we're going to peel the layers of the onion back a little bit. This is my favorite part. When Anthony and I were working on planning out the show, uh, there is so much controversy. I was trained to seal a crawl space, completely. And then, as I started helping out, with Nash on the distribution arm a little bit, with our family of companies at the time, we realized, wow, people do things a little bit differently in different areas, specifically, when we were getting to the South, Southeast. And that's when we're going to these conferences, and it was like, almost heated debates. So I know that there's contractors listening right now and they're shaking their head and they're like, "Oh yeah, I mean it's like the old, tastes great, less filling, what, Bud versus Bud Light." So I have to ask you, like, how, when you're thinking about the crawl space environment and the different opinions in the industry, encapsulated versus vented, some are like heavy into dehues, some don't believe in that. Why do you think these topics are creating, so much debate in that industry?
Sure. Well, I think it's on a couple different levels. I'll say, first of all, I think part of the challenge comes in just sheer vocabulary. Like, I know that sounds really strange, but I think there is a lot of, well, what is an encapsulation? Like, we'll have everything from it's a conditioned space using air conditioning to, "Well, I close those little slidey things on the vents. It's
Hmm.
encapsulated," right? Like, we have, like, what is, the definition of encapsulation? Ventilation is, is it passive? Is it the what I call kind of the do nothing? Is it a fan on a humidistat? Is it a controlled ventilation system? Even ventilation has a wide range of meaning to different people. And so I think as a starting point, everyone is using different words in different ways. And we get a little bit into this. I mean, it's sort of human nature. We get a little bit into this us them mindset. And what I'm going to try to argue is that for the most part, there's a lot more commonality across the industry in what everyone really thinks and believes if we got past some of the verbiage of how we're describing it. And so I think that is kind of the first, part. I think the second part is geography is different. We have a big country,
Mhm.
right? We have a
Yeah.
big country. And so I think we sometimes forget that, Mississippi, California, the Pacific Northwest, Minneapolis, the Midwest, and Ohio, where you guys are, they're all very different. Seasons are different, weather patterns are different, construction is sometimes different. So there's a lot of variation across the board in geography that plays into this a little bit as well. And so what might be a perfect solution is in one place and in other, might not be as good. And then I'll give a third part. I think sometimes there's a difference between theory and execution. And I
Mhm.
think that there are lots of things that are a great idea if everything works perfectly. And in new construction, often you can control that from beginning to end. And when you get into retrofits, a lot of times it's difficult to sometimes make that perfect in whatever your method is. Sometimes the execution falls apart. And I'm not saying shoddy work, like that's could be part of it, but I'm just saying like it's just sometimes incredibly difficult to do some of what the theory is suggesting that you do. So I think you've got all these different things at play.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, anytime you think about if you did something from the beginning, and Anthony and I were actually just with one of our clients and we were talking about like waterproofing appropriately on a new build,
Right.
versus going in and destroying everything to put in a waterproofing system like after the fact. So I
Right.
totally get that. And I'm sure the listeners do too. So
Yeah.
I mean, that translates into like our day to day sometimes too. Like, Mike, how many times have we gone to a business owner and they want us to retrofit their website? And
yes.
it's like the solutions, like if we were able to build it from scratch, are different than what we would have to apply if we're just tacking onto it, doing like an addition type of thing.
Correct.
So
So
true.
Yep. Absolutely.
now, what are what are the biggest misconceptions in your mind that contractors have about crawl spaces?
Well, I think it's sort of, I'll build on that, like everyone thinking that we have all these different approaches, right? And I think if we get into, I'm going to try to not get too deep into science because at some point it will be like so either convoluted or complicated that we're going to get to lose people and the listeners will be like, oh my gosh, this is what was she talking about? So I'm going to try to keep it sort of simple as much as I can. But I think the misconception sometimes is still one of of that we're so different, that everyone's approach is so different. And I think fundamentally there's a lot more that we agree on. If we really took all the crawl space, people that touch a crawl space, and there are many, right? We touch on so many different industries of people who end up in a crawl space. But I think there's a couple fundamental parts that most would agree with. You just mentioned waterproofing, right? Waterproofing is really the step number one. I don't care what you're doing later. Waterproofing is step number one. Number two, ground moisture is primarily the primary source of the moisture coming into a crawl space. Vapor barrier is the easiest way to suppress that moisture. We can debate on how we do it, but vapor barrier is still like the first line of defense. Those two are pretty much a given. No matter what you're going to do next, you're starting with those two. And then the third part is really, how are you going to dry it, right? What are we going to do to keep the space dry? So I think we've recognized that we've got those three portions that for the most part, everyone agrees on. Now, how do we do that? That's where we start getting into misconceptions, a little bit of, I'm not even sure if it's misconceptions as much as it's different strategies and different ways that people can tackle those different things. I can, go on into like, I think we're another place where we fundamentally disagree or do agree is if you think about building science, like we take a step back, not just in the crawl space, right? So I'm going to throw out some phrases that you've probably heard. So how often have you heard, build it tight, ventilate it right? Okay.
Yes.
Probably heard that, right? Okay. So that would be one. The other one that I hear a lot in building science is you have to contain it in order to control it. Okay. So if you've got a drafty house or a spot that's, the air is just kind of moving in and out, it's hard to control something that isn't contained. So if we take those two different things, right? So one, start with, kind of closing off vents or closing up a space. That's the contain it to control it portion. The second part would be seal it tight. Once again, we're containing it. And now the ventilate it right portion is a portion, in our opinion, of that drying. It's only a portion, like there's more to it. We can get into that later. But once again, I think the misconceptions are thinking that we're talking past each other without really listening to what other opinions are saying.
Yeah, no, I mean, obviously we've heard those and that it kind of segues perfectly into the thought. I know, some say myth, some say fact, but
Right.
You're talking about like potentially pulling outside air into a crawl space. And I'll just say, the way I was trained, and I know you and I had talked about this as well.
Yeah.
I was trained that pulling outside air in, was bad for the crawl space. And, that's why, like, why isn't that always true?
Yes, sure. But now we're going to get a little bit into weather. So, I mean, once again, I
Regional
think
too, yeah.
regional too, right? So I think unless you're maybe lucky enough to live in San Diego, where the weather appears to be sort of the same year round, the rest of us in this country, we have summer, we have fall, we have winter, we have spring. The weather is different in all of those seasons. We also have cold fronts and warm fronts that come through. So even within a different, week's time, you've got major fluctuations in what the outside air is in terms of what the weather is, right? And so the easiest way I kind of think about it to like just make it really simple is if you have a car, whether you have a convertible or just a regular car, there are days where you are like, I can't wait to put that top down. I can't wait to go outside. It feels amazing. When it feels amazing, it is probably a cooler, drier day. And on the days where it's not, you're like, oh, it's awful. There's a lot of days though, in the summer in the Southeast where it's like, oh, can't wait to get that air conditioning going. I got to crank that air conditioning up. But we as humans naturally recognize, just intuition wise, that there are days where the weather is different, right? We do that naturally. So those days that you want to put your top down, if you're lucky enough to have a convertible, that's the day that the outside air is cool and dry. And so those dew points, once again, I'm going to jump ahead a little bit to the science part. We can get into that a little bit, but I don't know how else to explain it entirely. When the air outside is cool and dry, it is going to be lower in moisture level than what you have in your crawl space. So that air, by a moisture standpoint, is quote unquote good. When we have the flip side, the day that we absolutely have to have that air conditioning, it's 95 degrees outside. It's 95% humidity and we're like dripping with sweat before we've even stepped outside. Well, that outside air is bad. And I can go and explain how and why, but that outside air is bad. So I think it's just a recognition that there's seasonal changes. There are weekly changes, and how often the air is quote good and how often the air is bad depends a little bit on your geography.
Right. So you jumped ahead and you mentioned dew point. That's perfect. Because I want to talk about the difference between relative humidity and dew point and why dew point is actually more important.
Yeah. And I don't even know if it's sort of more important. It depends on the application, right? They're both meaningful numbers. And let me just give a quick definition. Okay. So relative humidity, which we hear all the time, is a percentage. It is a percentage of the amount of moisture that air mass is holding. Okay. Now, the key word to relative humidity that we often gloss over is that word relative. Okay. It's relative to a specific temperature. So this is kind of the common way that relative humidity is described is if you think of like a glass of water, you've got like your small little dainty, juice glass. And on the other side, you've got like your big, big gulp from your local convenience store. Think of the big gulp as a hot day and your middle dainty juice glass as a cold day. And that the colder temperature, got to go back to your middle school science days, cold air can hold less moisture as hot air, as air gets hotter, those molecules expand and it can hold more moisture. So hot days can hold more moisture. Cool days can hold very little moisture. So a 50% relative humidity, we'll just use that number, means you are halfway full. The air is holding half of what it can hold in its air mass. Same thing. So hot day, you can hold a lot of moisture. Cold day, you can hold very little. Crawl spaces are typically in that 70 degrees. They're probably somewhere in the middle between the like small juice glass and the big gulp, right? They're kind of in the middle, right? So typically the 50% number or the percentage of how much moisture an air mass can hold. Now let's flip over to dew point. And this messes with people's mind. It's kind of hard to kind of comprehend what dew point is. Dew point is measured as a temperature. And the temperature, it is basically saying, if we took this same air mass, at what temperature do we have to cool it to, or at what temperature would this air mass hit 100% relative humidity? Okay. So it's really a measure in an absolute number of how much moisture is in the air, if that makes sense. So inside when we're talking about humidity, let's just use a fan on a humidistat and why that is tricky. And that's a big misconception sometimes that we are a fan on a humidistat. And so I'm going to try to explain why we are not that. So let's take that 70-degree crawl space, right? We've got sort of the 70-degree crawl space and it doesn't really matter what the relative humidity is. It's kind of nice and cool under there. And now we've got a fan on a humidistat that goes, humidity is high. Well, first of all, it's probably close to the edge of the outside. And even if it's the crawl space that's high, it doesn't really matter. At some point, it triggers that on some number, it goes, relative humidity is high. So it starts running that fan. Well, if it's pulling the air from the outside on a summer day, you are now taking that 90-degree temperature with, pick a number, 80% humidity, doesn't matter. Super high dew point number, oppressive air. You're taking that air mass from outside that's full of moisture, drawing it into the crawl space, which is colder. So remember, cold temperature can hold less moisture. Now we're bringing that air mass in. All that moisture went in there. It's cooling it off and it's going, yeah, this air, I can't hold this. I got no place for this air to go. And all of it's going to create condensation on the ducting, on the wood, whatever. Okay. So if you're looking at high humidity, like a humidity number alone in that scenario, it will have a negative effect on a crawl space in that application. Okay. On a, dehumidifiers also run on humidity. Once again, you're not using two different air masses. So it's not as problematic to have a dehumidifier run on a humidistat level because it's measuring it within the one place. When you start getting into, ventilation, now you're exchanging air. The key is, you'd mentioned that like outside air is bad. So aside from a fresh air exchange for air quality purposes, from a moisture standpoint, we want to make sure that the dew point outside is lower and that the air mass outside is holding less moisture and is drier air than what is inside the crawl space. And the only way to do that is really to compare the two air masses with full information. And dew point is just a calculated number from relative humidity and temperature. So that's, I went through a whole lot of science in there. So hopefully everyone could kind of stick with it because that dew point.
No, I understand it better.
Oh, no.
I feel the same, actually. Miriam, I've heard the explanation quite a bit over the years, but that was a very easy to understand explanation. And it's funny because it now makes me see the scenarios very different. My assumption was we're either closing this sucker off or we're venting it, and understanding there are potential benefits to bringing the better air into this environment. But my thought always was, oh my gosh, if we're bringing air into, this crawl space, we're instantly going to get condensation. So your explanation actually kind of.
The seasonality makes a big difference, right? The time of year, the weather, we've got spring here in North Carolina. It's been an amazing week of like really low humidity numbers in moderate temperatures. I mean, we don't have that for the whole summer. I'm not going to say it's going to be like that in July, but right now it's been amazing.
Yeah,
Right.
and we just went back and forth too in Ohio. It was weird.
Mm.
Anthony and I flew back in yesterday. It was in the 70s, like high 70s. I mean,
Mhm.
it was hot. And,
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
know, today we had a whole bunch of thunderstorms. It came in last night. And then today, I mean, we're like in the 30s and it's
Yeah.
uncomfortable.
And but it changes constantly.
Yeah,
I mean, the key is weather is a little unpredictable, but it definitely always changes.
for
It's
sure.
predictable that way.
Well,
Yeah, no,
the way that you explained it, it makes me wonder, like, why is the industry kind of like it's a one size fit all, like kind of all or nothing approach on the solution?
yeah.
Well, I think that when you only look at humidity, it is problematic. Like, I think it is problematic. And I think that's maybe the part that, it takes that sort of extra dew point step, which gets into a little bit more of a complex decision making of, we always talk about we need proper ventilation. Well, how do you define proper and how do you achieve that? I think
Hmm.
that's the tricky part, right? Because if we have passive ventilation, it's coming in all the time. So in certain places, basically you're playing the odds in passive ventilation. You're just hoping that there are more dry days than there are wet days. It's going to be bad on some days, and other days it's going to be okay. And 50, 40 years ago, our weather certainly changed a little bit over time. It was probably okay, or the house wasn't as cool. Like, there's so many things that have changed in homes and construction that we get that question a lot. Like, my house used to be fine. Why is it a problem now? Well,
Mm,
so many factors are contributing to changes in homes that there's just a lot going on, and it's a little too much for everyone to keep up with because we all have other interesting things in our life than just studying crawl space relative humidity numbers and so forth. So I think sometimes just keeping it simple is what sometimes gets us in trouble a little bit of trying to understand it.
Yeah, I mean, I really liked your like car analogy. Is like in my head, it sent me to thinking about when you just open your windows on a nice day,
Yeah.
right? Like you create that draft coming through your house, and like automatically, in like through like you said through your intuition that
Yeah.
the air outside is better than the air inside. So
Right.
it just makes
Yeah,
sense.
it's a low dew point. So I used to always kind of jokingly say the only people who talk about dew point are your meteorologists and someone who works for Atmox. Because if you go to if you go to like your local weather, like if you start listening for it, they often talk about dew point because dew point, separate from just your temperature, is how it really feels, right? You can have, people in Arizona are like, oh, but it's a dry heat. Well, there's a little, it's still hot, but there's a little something to that in that it feels more comfortable than oppressively hot and humid heat. And so it's that, same kind of concept. So meteorologists love to talk about it. We talk about it a lot just because you've got to really understand what's in the air mass that you are trying to improve. And so that's really where that comes into play.
Okay. So I want to talk more about the product now.
Okay.
Kind of switch focuses here. And for the contractors who might not be familiar with your system, can you explain how Atmox works?
Sure. Okay, so basically, in a nutshell, Atmox is really a system of products, and it starts really with the controller. So the controller is basically sort of the brain or the hub of everything that kind of comes together. It's where the power source is for all the fans, but it's also primarily where the software and the logic resides. And so from there, it's also got a notification portion where like a homeowner can see kind of what's going on. But in a nutshell, that controller is using two sensors, one inside the crawl space, one outside, measuring temperature and humidity. You might have guessed based on our previous conversation, calculating dew point on both of those, for both of those information. And then from there, basically going through a series of logic questions. So on a basic level, it's always going, what operation do we need to improve the conditions in the space? And it's just kind of going through that, like every few seconds, it's kind of going through that logic. First, it's going to start with, can we use outside air to dry the space? Like, we're making sure it's not too cold, like there's some temperature cutoffs and parameters to make sure we're not changing the temperature range too much. But it goes, is the outside air actually drier? And if so, is it a powerful drying action at this moment in time? If so, it's going to run fans. So that would be component number one, is ventilation. So Atmox manufactures fans. Typically, we would use an exhaust and an intake to kind of balanced ventilation. They're typically on louvers, so when the fans are not running, everything stays closed. So we're going to run ventilation fans first. The next thing that we're going to do is circulation fans. Anytime those ventilation fans are running, we have additional joist mounted fans that anyone who has spent time in a crawl space fully gets, because they're going, well, this is not a perfect rectangle, or this is not an open space. And we've got areas of this crawl space that are not getting air movement or flow, whether it's from these ventilation fans or from the dehumidifier. So we place joist mounted fans for circulation purposes. So they're going to run with the ventilation component, like they're going to run together. So then it goes through its calculations, day changes, it gets hotter, more humid. It goes, oh, stop, no more ventilation. We don't want that anymore. It's now bad. And it says, okay, well, what's the condition in the crawl space like? If the humidity is getting higher, it first starts those circulation fans. The first line of defense is like, let's just stir this air. Let's get it moving, because we can balance out temperature differential in the space. So for example, we talked about those cold ducts. We want to keep the air moving as much as possible. So circulation starts first. If it keeps going up and it's like, wait a second, the humidity has gone even higher than we like, assuming the dehumidifier has been connected to the system. We don't manufacture dehumidifiers. We integrate with other dehumidifiers. It goes, okay, we've gotten out of the range that we feel comfortable with. Let's turn that dehumidifier on and keep those circulation fans running to expand the reach of the dehumidifier to those other pockets or additions or sections. And then it just basically kind of keeps going through that cycle and goes, all right, we need dehumidification. Nope, we're good. Turn it off. Maybe we just wait and see. Maybe everything's good, and just kind of keeps going through that cycle of what is in the best interest of the crawl space at this moment in time. Just really combining those drying actions as much as possible.
Yeah, it's interesting because it really sounds like, this is I'm going to just say a smarter approach. When you were saying that the fans that would draw in the outside air, are potentially on louvers, that kind of gives me that feel. Okay, if it's not active right now, louvers are closed. We have the sealed crawl space. It's
Right.
only going to draw this in if the outside air is good, and then inside air we're moving things around. It's funny because we had the conversation for many years of like, hey, we do need to throw in some additional fans to try to get this moving around, because some of these larger crawl spaces where they have bends or whatever, the air wasn't circulating. You could just go into that area and feel how heavy it was. So I'm kind of curious because it just keeps taking me back to like, well, why is everyone fixed in this sense of we just need to be encapsulated or we just need to be vented, when it sounds like a smarter system or a smarter way of doing things exists, with Atmox?
Sure. I mean, and I think what we really are just looking at is what's the best drying action, right? There are companies that do this in a whole host of different ways, right? So we're making the assumption that they're using dehumidifier. There are, of course, companies that don't use dehumidifiers. There are other ways that people dry space with conditioned air and some other things as well.
Mhm.
If we keep the topic, sort of focused on dehumidification, which is probably the most common in most parts of the country, maybe not new construction, but we'll stick within that realm for right now without further confusing everything. But I think the key is, the dehumidifier is the workhorse in the peak of summer, particularly in the Southeast. The dehumidifier is still the workhorse, but the goal is really to recognize that the dehumidifier uses, a fair amount of electricity. Low voltage DC fans are going to use very little electricity. So we're trying to minimize that electricity usage a little bit from one on one hand. And then the next part is recognizing that air exchange, right? So I think, you talked about, ventilation being sort of all or nothing. I think there are a fair number of contractors that are incorporating fans either for circulation purposes or even for outside ventilation. Like you're seeing it more and more. And I think they're doing it for a wide range of reasons. But I think that, even the most perfectly sealed vapor barrier, the most perfectly sealed space over time, if it really was done that well, that's really perfectly sealed, it does get a little bit of kind of stale and stagnant air. And you do potentially get some, different organic growth happening beneath the plastic that can sometimes come up through the plastic. Or, sometimes people will talk about smells, and, a lot of that has changed over time. It's not so much that the crawl space is getting, out of control with the moisture standpoint, but the air exchange portion is the other part. Like just from a fresh air exchange portion, the filters on the dehumidifiers are helpful. Filtering air is certainly, for particles and everything, a powerful tool as part of the overall equation of the whole thing. But, when you think about air quality, fundamentally, the easiest way to improve air quality, if you've got any kind of, VOCs or toxins or smells or whatever, you exchange it, right? I mean, I always kind of, jokingly say, if you burnt your toast, you're not going to turn your air conditioning on or run a dehumidifier. You're going to open a window or, run a fan or get that smell out. Now, obviously, we're not burning toast. It's not that extreme in the crawl space, but I'm just trying to illustrate that you get fresh air by exchanging it. And so I think that's the other part that we really are trying to push, that kind of getting that fresh air exchange just for an improvement of air quality, along with the drying component of the benefit of the drying component in 9 months out of the year in most places in our country. It's definitely not the same in July and August, but you got a good amount of seasonality where the outside air is dry.
Yeah, before we move on to the next segment, because I know Anthony's got this next portion. What I'm curious about,
Mhm.
and this was something that you and I kind of discussed before, and we did talk about we would like save this for the show.
Yeah.
So in my basement waterproofing
Yeah.
background, we would consistently go up against another organization. I won't mention their name or product, but they would go in and install these. And we always said, and since we're talking to contractors here, we called it staking the job, right? These guys would show up, they would run a lead, they would do a real brief inspection, at the home, and then they would just install this machine. And this machine was consistently drawing outside air in. And, if we would contact the homeowner, and like they would cancel us coming out, we're like, well, hold on a second, like why have you done that? Well, we had another company come out and they've already installed something, so it's already bringing in the fresh air, so we're good to go. We instantly knew what that was, and if we got back out to the home or got to someone that had it installed for some time, we could show the homeowner the amount of mold growth and inorganic or organic growth that was inside of this thing and like on their walls. So I think it's important to differentiate the Atmox system versus these other machines on the market that are just like maybe not so smart and trying to disguise themselves that way.
Yeah, I think the key is the fan, some kind of mechanical ventilation based on humidity, right? So probably, I don't know exactly what you're talking about, but there's if we're talking about some kind of mechanical ventilation that is running on a humidity mechanism, I already talked about a little bit in the beginning of the danger of doing that. And it's more, you need a comparison, right? How do you know you're improving it if you don't know what you're improving it with? Right. So wherever you're pulling it from, it's got to be better than what you started with. Otherwise, you're potentially either you're the same or worse. You just don't know. And so I think the key is that, once again, going back to that science of, you got to know the dew point to really know how much moisture is in that air mass, not just humidity, because unless you know the temperature, that's not enough. So I think that's part of it. And then recognizing you've got to compare the two. And that's really the only way you can use air exchange, is by understanding what are you exchanging it with. So I think that, there's a whole host of different ways that people tackle this. And, I think, once again, they all have applications in certain scenarios and certain geographies. They work better than others. And so I think, I don't think anyone designs a product with the intent of going, well, I'm going to create something that's going to create a problem. Like, no one does that. And usually they've tested it somewhere and they have had good success somewhere. I think this is part of recognizing that, what works in a northeast climate is going to be different than the deep south. Like, you're pulling in different air from different places. If you're using, other methods like air conditioning, well, you have houses that don't have air conditioning, or you have houses that are relying on air conditioning, but now you've got shoulder seasons in the spring and fall, and maybe the house is cool enough, or maybe the air conditioner is so efficient that it cuts on and off so fast that it never gets enough air movement for that. So that doesn't mean it's a bad idea necessarily. It just means in this particular house, it may not be working correctly based on these parameters. That's part of that theory and execution I talked about. Like, there's a lot of these ideas that are very, very good, but sometimes it gets difficult to execute them perfectly in the way that they're intended for a whole host of reasons. Just, reality is reality. And so sometimes it's just hard to overcome that.
Yeah, it sounds to me like what you get in a lot of ways with the Atmox system is the different the different methods that have been like worked out for solving this problem, but like done through like an intelligent conditional logic system. Like, if you need a sealed crawl space because that's what's best for it right now, it will seal it. If you need to just bring in some air because you need that circulation, or that air is, more like a better environment to be in right now than what's currently in the crawl space, then you just circulate that air. If you do need it to dehumidify and take moisture out of the space because you can't do it with the other methods, then you deploy that. But what the problem you'll see with some of those other solutions, like the one that Mike talked about, is theirs might be a smart solution for one of those conditions, but you've started to use it universally,
Mhm.
and it creates problems in those
Sure.
moments where
Yeah, and the other thing that I think we have to keep in mind, is I started with saying we're a system of products, right? So
Mhm,
we are not, I am not the one installing it. You're not the one installing it. There becomes moments where we don't necessarily always know exactly how our product is going to be used and installed. And so we try to make it as robust and adaptable as possible. If some people are using, it's the same thing with putting a dehumidifier in a crawl space, right? People use dehumidifiers in crawl spaces. They just throw them in there, right? They're not
Mhm.
sealing or encapsulating the space first. They're just using this tool to dry it out. Well, if you don't have that waterproofing is kind of a requirement. I don't know that you can shortchange waterproofing, but people certainly shortchange their vapor barrier in different
mhm,
ways. Well, if you do that, that doesn't mean that it's necessarily the whole thing's gonna fail. It might, but it might not. In that, it just means that everything else has to work harder. So it's a system of things coming together. So if your ground moisture is not fully covered, whether you put a dehumidifier in there or you're using outside ventilation, whatever your drying action is, it has to work harder. If you have great vapor barrier coverage and it's taped and sealed and you're really suppressing that, then any layer you put on top of that, it has to work less hard. So they all
mhm,
kind of go together. And so I think, regardless of what product you're using, it has to be a little bit adaptable to use in a wide variety of ways. We could talk about best practices till we're blue in the face, but we have to recognize also that for a wide variety of reasons, people are going to use it in different ways.
right.
Mhm.
And then just one more, and then
Yep.
I'll move
Yep.
it along. But the other thing that I thought was interesting that you said was in some solutions, people are just using a dehumidifier, right?
Yep.
And like that's your drying solution. But you mentioned it earlier, and it's actually a really important call out that using the dehumidifier is probably the highest resource intensive like piece of that system. The vapor barrier is, static and just stays there, right? The fans will, while using electricity, are going to use a lot less, and they don't
Sure.
have all those other components to them that can break down over time. So if you're just using a dehumidifier and that's your only drying action, you're going to run it out faster and probably have a little bit higher on the energy output.
Correct. So I think there's two parts to that. One is the energy output part, and I think the other is recognizing where the dehumidifiers are powerful. So once again, no shout out to all my dehumidifier vendors that are out there. Like I love you all, and I'm not trying to say anything that's bad about dehumidifiers. We certainly partner with all of you, but a dehumidifier is rated to work. If you look at ratings, like 70 pints per day on a typical dehumidifier, that's at 80 degrees. Okay. So as you get colder in that space, now once again, most of them, if they're sealed and insulated well, you're going to be staying the 70. But if you get crawl spaces that are colder, particularly if they didn't, seal up some stuff, you get colder. Remember, cold air can't hold as much moisture. That dehumidifier gets less and less effective as it gets colder. And it has to work just a lot harder to achieve that, whatever you set that dehumidifier at 55%, 60%, whatever it is. So in the winter, where you actually don't have a whole lot of moisture to getting that incremental number down makes that dehumidifier work extraordinarily hard when all you could have to do is you've got 36-degree dew point outside. The dehumidifier can't even achieve that. 36-degree dew point outside, you open some fans, and within 2 hours, the whole space is dry, right? Whereas the dehumidifier in that colder environment is really working very, very, hard, or at some point can't achieve it. Now, we don't need to be getting into these low numbers most of the time, but it doesn't know that. Like it's going to try, and so it's going to work really hard. So I think recognition once again that seasonality matters, temperature matters. We try to minimize that use as much as possible to make it last longer and to minimize that energy usage.
Yeah,
Yeah,
no, that
thanks for
makes
pointing that
it
out.
makes a ton of sense. That's why I wanted to explore that a little
Yeah,
bit
yeah,
further. I do want to switch focuses again, and
yeah.
I know the contractors and like our audience is really going to love this. It's one of my pet passions to talk about where where is opportunity being like missed or overlooked. So on the business side of things, like where do you see contractors leaving money on the table when we're talking about crawl space services and like solving those problems?
Sure. Well, I think first of all, crawl spaces, it's interesting because there are now companies that are solely crawl space focused, right? There are some that are solely in that industry, but many of them or most of them, it is a secondary service to something else, right?
Mhm.
Whether it's an HVAC company, it's a pest control company, it's a mold remediation company, it's a foundation repair company. They are often the ones who are seeing the problem because they're doing some kind of, they're in there for some other reason, and then they provide this service, which is great. We work on all of these, with all of these different types of companies. So I think they fall into different categories a little bit on where they leave money on the table. So I think some of them, depending on what their primary, function is or primary job, some of them will recognize an opportunity and then they will not make a recommendation to fix it. So
Mhm.
I think that they are sometimes afraid of the ask. Like they're afraid of the large dollar ask. And so I think that falls a lot in, sometimes I'm going to say that as a whole, I'm really stereotyping here. So, this is,
Right.
I'm making a broad brush generalization, but, oftentimes pest control services, for example,
Mhm.
have a lower ticket item. So all of a sudden to have this big ticket crawl space work is a big ask for them. And they're sort of afraid to make the ask on the install side. I think that mold remediation does the same thing. They're out there to fix we've been hired to fix the mold. We're gonna clean it, but they're not doing anything to proactively make sure it doesn't come back again. Well, they're like, well, I'm
Right.
afraid to add any more money on top of this ticket. I'm afraid I won't get the job if I make this other recommendation. So I think part of it is you've got to get comfortable with making the ask. Like you've got to recognize if you're going to do this work, you've got to be comfortable on the sales side, making the ask and explaining what the benefit is and why this is important to whatever you did, whatever reason you were there in the first place, right? Like it matters for pest, it matters for mold. So I think making the ask is for some of them the problem. I think the other portion is recognizing the ability to have an annual maintenance contract. And I've heard you guys talk about this numerous times. In your conversations with your clients and on your podcast. And I think once again, like on the flip side, the HVAC companies and the pest control companies are very good at that because they are used to already going out, whether it's quarterly, semi-annually, annually, whatever. They have that kind of back end structure in place, right? They know their software, I don't know how it works, whatever their call center is equipped to structure and handle that annual maintenance. Then you have other companies who are kind of getting into this um, crawl space industry, and they are used to one job at a time. So they're going out and they're having to get each job new. Each time they have to get a new job. And then the idea of setting up the annual portion is like a operational hurdle for some of them. However,
Mhm.
if they would add that, which any crawl space work, even if you're just putting a dehumidifier in there, that dehumidifier has filters in it. They either need to be cleaned or replaced. So if you are doing, forget the Atmox portion. If you are doing any work in a crawl space, it should be checked periodically, and you should check for changes in the house and all kinds of stuff. I could go into that technical side a little bit deeper, but from the business standpoint, I think it's your ability to go back and talk to that homeowner and make sure that you don't want to add something else. You could cross sell, you could upsell, particularly if you have other services. It gets you back in
Yes.
front of that homeowner over and over again and becomes top of mind when their neighbor has a problem and you're like, oh, well, I love such and such guys. They were just here yesterday. You should really call them. If you're not top of mind, they're going to forget about you. So I think it's, a building the relationship with the homeowner, doing a service because the average homeowner is just not going in their crawl space on their own. Like they're just not. And so I think they need that annual maintenance. So I think the two things, make the ask, do an annual service plan. That was a long-winded answer for that short
No,
result.
it was a great answer. I think you nailed it 100 on the pop quiz to me, because I say the same things, and I kind of picked up on where you were going as well when it came to the separation of the industries, because it is those lower ticket, like average businesses that have the trouble getting over that hurdle of putting a couple zeros on a
Yes,
contract, right?
yes.
Um, and you notice that in every business and every industry too. So like whenever you have a big variation of services too, like if you're the sales manager or the sales coach, you're going to notice that one of my guys is really good at my higher ticket items and one of my guys is terrible at my higher ticket items. And it really a lot of the times it's kind of a mentality thing. They have to get over that ask. They have to be comfortable with the amount of money that is being written on that paper as well. I know, like when I first got into marketing, and I did not grow up with a lot of money in my hands, right? And when you ask somebody for thousands of dollars, it's like, whoa, right? But you have to get over it. It's a matter of protecting the home. They need the service done. Just ask, and nothing bad will happen, I promise.
Yes.
But and then the other thing that you mentioned was kind of the regularity in which you would be in a home.
Hmm.
For the pest control, the HVAC, those people who are regular touches, if you're not offering one of these services, this one of those like clear no-brainer upsells, you are leaving money on the table. You get the privilege of being in that home every year, and so when you get that opportunity, that's a chance to sell that job every single time. And maybe they say no this year, but maybe they say yes the next time, right? So
Yeah. And some of those, as a little add on, what we've told some of there's, we have some smaller companies and they're like, well, I don't think I have the crews that can do this work, or, I can't manage that. Then we try to partner them with somebody who's in a different vertical so that they're not competing, but they could refer the business over. So let's say if
yes.
you've got a pest control company who sees it all the times, but they're like, we just can't, I just don't have the bandwidth to tackle this kind of work, whatever it is. And then we're like, okay, well, here's a waterproofing company. They're not going to start spraying for bugs. You guys should partner where you could, solve your homeowner's problem, be a provider of a solution without actually doing the work. So there's some other ways that, since we have so many of these different, industries, they don't really compete against each other for the most part.
Yeah, and it's really wild too. When you were saying that, it took me back, and I was like, "Oh my gosh!" I remember the evolution that I saw because for a long time, foundation repair and waterproofing, we were doing crawl space encapsulation on a regular basis, and that wasn't a big thing for us. And then, we had like Advanclean and Terminix come to us and say, "Hey, we're interested in this. We want to buy some products. We think that this is a complimentary, service." And so they went through training, and it was funny because they picked it up really quick. So you had a restoration, company that comes in and picks it up. You have a pest maintenance company that comes in and picks it up. Then we heard, like in our local area, Atlas Butler, HVAC, they started picking it up and doing encapsulation. And each of those, you could tell early on they were having difficulty asking for that bigger ticket at first, but they could get out and service things on a regular basis. And we kind of picked up that same thing on the annual maintenance side. We were like, oh yeah, we got to get out more often and kind of pick up some of what they're doing too. So the big ticket part, I saw the evolution of those companies when they were kind of going through the training at Nash. It was really interesting. So with that in mind, what contractors or businesses do you find are most successful in implementing your system?
Sure. Well, I think this is really what I'm going to say is probably true of any business anywhere. Like, I don't know if it's really unique to our space. So I think that there are two things that I personally think are sort of like the fundamentals of sales success. One is knowledge. You have to know what you're selling. So the salesperson needs to be reasonably well educated. They don't have to be able to spit out all the junk that I just spit out, but they got to know enough about what they're trying to do and what they're trying to accomplish in the space. So knowledge is number one. Number two is I feel like nothing beats passion. Like, you have got to be excited about what you're selling. You've got to believe in what you're selling. You've got to be able to convey that your company is the best. And you've got to kind of believe it and sell it and own it. And so knowledge and passion on the sales side is like the first kind of recipe for success. Now, anybody anywhere could take what I just said and use those same words and probably find them true. Okay. I don't know that that's unique to cross-space world. The second part might be in that I think the second part in terms of finding success is making sure that you've got your install teams well trained. So I think, once again, if you've got well trained install teams where they are both efficient, like they're not wasting time when they're doing the install, and they're not, doing sloppy work or something is, where they're going to have to come back and fix something later. I think that's another super important part is it's someone at the top is sort of going, all right, there's two parts to this. The sales side, we got to empower our salespeople, make sure they're well educated, and we've got to make sure that our install teams are well trained. So I think there's two parts to be successful.
Oh, makes
Right.
sense.
Um, and actually, that kind of teases out my next question. I was going to ask, what traits do those contractors need to have? That's kind
Yeah.
of the education and you know support from their like their trainers. And like you said, it's true for every business. It's true for our agency, for example. What do you think contractors can do to add more in crawl space work specifically for like recurring revenues? So on the waterproofing side, on the encapsulation side, um, and like even on the foundation repair side, because we work with a lot of those businesses, they usually kind of kit
Right.
those services together. A lot of the times it is this: you service the home one time type of thing. And I want to know what you think is a way to help them get more into the flow of a recurring service.
I mean, I think, from the Atmox side, obviously, we're now still talking about a crawl space inspection, right? So something related to it's sort of the obvious, doing the dehumidifier, you know, um, filter changes, brushing off some fans. But I think the main thing, and I don't know that this would be a different revenue stream so much, would be really looking at the house, sort of like taking a step back and looking at the house. And what I mean by that, and this is difficult to do because you don't always come on different weather days and so forth, but I think contractors need to start looking at the whole house a little bit. So, for
Hmm.
example, if you see a house that constantly has gutters that are completely clogged and overflowing, then that is going to affect the waterproofing in their foundation.
Hmm.
If you see, like, oh, you just did a whole new landscaping project, well, now you've got either it's better or worse, right? It could go either way, but depending on where you took, maybe you took shrubbery or trees out that were stopping water from coming toward a house, and now they're gone, and now you've got water runoff, or you've got a new HVAC system that's keeping that crawl space colder, and maybe before it was kind of hanging on with its do nothing strategy, and now you have a new problem. Or there's so many different things, but that's a lot of like, what can we be looking at when we're there? And then, of course, you can't do all of those services yourself, but once again, this might be a how can you add value to that homeowner by looking at it a little bit broader, or working with a referral group of partners potentially to do some of those other services.
Yeah, that's one thing. I actually talked to another client the other day about this, and it's for your salespeople too, right? Because there is an efficiency problem with some of these services where the homeowner doesn't really know what their problem is. And so they'll invite a lot of different people into their home and say, hey, what's going on here? Right. And some of the times you're the company that doesn't actually have the solution that they need in order to fix the problem. And, like you kick the dirt on your way out, and like really that salesperson could get a little bit of revenue. There's very good and robust referral systems with tons of businesses out there. And like, some of them are contingent on the job closing, right? But you're going to have a percentage rate of whatever that business will close. So if you refer them and their referral close rate is like 50% of the time, you just got the kickback for it.
Yeah.
So at least if you're not taking that revenue back directly into the business, give it back to your salespeople, coach them, train them to recommend the right people. And like one thing that one of my clients does is whenever they do that, they also push to get a review, right?
Yeah.
They say, hey, homeowner, I came here and I didn't try to sell you some BS, and I,
Right.
set you up with the right person to talk to solve the problem of your home. I hope you enjoyed the experience. You mind leaving a review? Like, and you walk out a little bit more money in your pocket for your sales team and a review that brings value back to the business. So,
Sure.
Yeah, so I'm curious, when we're thinking about, if a company's already doing crawl space encapsulation, how do they, fit something like Atmox into that service offering?
Sure. Well, I mean, if you're already doing encapsulation, we're going to assume once again with dehumidifier, like then really you're kind of adding on, right? So you're updating or elevating your full service from what you currently have. So really, you're adding the controller, the circulation fans, and the ventilation fans. Everything else that you did is pretty much exactly the same, except for depending on the size of the space, you're leaving two vents, whether one intake, one exhaust. Maybe if it's a bigger house, maybe it's two and two, you're leaving a few vents where you've got the ability to add those fans in the vent openings. So really, it's just an elevation of, telling the homeowner, like, look, we know you care about two things fundamentally. You're going to want to protect that investment of your house. We want to keep that house, mold and fungal growth free. We want to keep it dry. We want to make sure we've got all of the structure protected. And we know you care about the air quality in your home. And I think the air quality part is something that, is part of this story of we're going to make sure that we get a fresh air exchange. We're going to make sure that air doesn't stay stale. We're going to minimize that dehumidifier use for you. We can also, I didn't talk about it, but we also have lights that can be added onto the controller. There's a whole section for an output of lights. So for someone who's doing crawl space encapsulations, you want to add lights from that display. There's a little button, you press the button and the lights turn on. It's great for service work because you can turn it on before you go down there. So, if they are using it for some other reason, the lights just brighten up the whole space. And then the other key part is when you're done with all that, the homeowner kind of forgets about what's down there, or they can't really see it. They've got that display in their, garage or utility room. You just say, look, you've got peace of mind. You can watch this monitor. It'll alert you if something is off. You can see what's operating at this given time. And if you see something that's concerning to you, then give me a call. You don't have to even go down there. And so that notification kind of component, as kind of the final step, it's really an elevation of everything that you're already doing.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's great advice. And I'm sure, those that are listening that are currently offering crawl space encapsulation, a lot of what Anthony was also dipping in was, how can you make more out of this? And we're always looking at that, like how much more juice can be squeezed out of this opportunity? Because if it's right in front of you and you had this and you ran this lead and, it looks like you're going to have waterproofing, crawl space encapsulation, dehumidification, it sounds like Atmox could be a really nice add-on that brings a lot of things. I didn't even know about the lighting. That's pretty
Yeah,
sweet.
I mean, that's like
I love
it
the
doesn't
lighting.
it doesn't fit into the moisture control components. Sometimes
Yep.
we get, it gets added confusion of adding all these different little bells and whistles that it has. But it is a really nice feature, and you don't have to run additional electrical wiring. All 12-volt DC goes straight from the same power supply that the controller has on it. So for an encapsulation, it really can make it kind of pop there at the end.
I
And
was going to say for presentation
Oh,
purposes,
yeah.
like your before and afters, like
yeah,
being able to reuse that job to get your next job, it does add, like, elevates the value there as well. Um, and it sounds to me like what you're saying is people who are doing encapsulation, they should have this as a, like, good, better, best, just regardless. Like
yeah.
if the homeowner wants this elevated experience for the home and, that extra protection, give them the option and, like, walk out with a little bit bigger projects and, like, a better solution for the homes.
Right. Well, and I think you do have, I think sometimes we in our industry think that everyone knows what all these terms and everything means, and that we have a little bit of this kind of group thing going where we're all kind of thinking the same way. And then you talk to people who aren't in the industry, like an average homeowner, and they sometimes are like, "Well, what do you mean you're going to close everything off?" I mean, you will get these every time you get these homeowners who are like, "Well, that doesn't seem logical to me," or like you'll get a little bit of pushback on that. And so, like I said, the Atmox system is really designed to kind of bridge all of these different things into one system. So really, regardless of the the mindset of the homeowner, it kind of, not that we want to be all wishy-washy, but we can kind of adjust. You could adjust a little bit, right? Like if it's, I want everything to be closed off, Mr. or Mrs. Homeowner is going to be closed off. We're only going to use that outstair when, when it's beneficial and we've got fans with louvers. And if someone else is like, well, I don't want you to close it all off. Well, we're not going to, Mr. or Mrs. Homeowner, because we have fans that are going to run to bring in that outside air as needed. So you can adjust your pitch a little bit. But fundamentally, the products, like from the Atmox system, the products are exactly the same, right? What it's doing is exactly the same. It's just a little bit of positioning, to kind of, just listen to the homeowner and see where their mindset is.
Well, that's great. I want to kind of dip into your mind a little bit and kind of get your opinion on where you think like crawl space moisture management is headed, in the
Yeah.
next decade.
Sure. Well, I alluded to this a little bit with kind of looking at the house a little bit broader. I think there's going to be a little bit more of looking at how the crawl space affects the house in general, right? Not looking at it in isolation, like going, okay, well, this is part of the overall house. What does that mean? And looking at kind of as you make a change somewhere else, how does it affect, these other aspects? So I think part of it is going to be a recognition that we've got to look at the house as a system entirely. So I think that's one thing that I think is going to be important. And the second is really this, the air quality. Like there is so much more focus on indoor air quality in the last, I would say, particularly 5 years. Like I think, when we went through COVID, we heard a lot about indoor air quality. All of a sudden, we were all kind of, in our houses more. There was a lot of discussion over like what's safe and what's not safe. And as soon as you have better ventilation, it's better for your house and your home inside your house. And so I think that whole understanding the need for fresh air exchanges in a home in general, I think is coming to the forefront more and more of recognizing that need for, IAQ as part of it. And I think there's also this push to healthy homes in general. It's funny. I always, I think those of us who don't live on the West Coast always look for trends coming from the West Coast. Like, I think this is sort of naturally how that seems to happen. And we have more kind of contractors or homeowners that we get calls from people who are calling themselves healthy home consultants. And that is their kind of full-time job. They're advising high-end homeowners on how to make their home healthier from top to bottom. And so if we're looking to the West Coast for trends that will potentially come a little bit later, which doesn't always happen, but sometimes does, I think that healthy home portion is going to be part of the overall equation. So I think really looking at how the crawl space fits into that is where I see some of that going.
Yeah, that's interesting. I know, you and I had spoken previously about like just the fact that homes are getting sealed tighter and tighter. And where is this fresh air going to come from? And how are you having any sort of, exchange and air and circulation? And obviously, you had brought up the fact that it can get very dangerous for homeowners if there isn't some sort of exchange taking place. That was really something that caught my attention too, because the focus has been on sealing everything so tight in these
Hmm.
Right,
homes.
right. And there, it's like I said, it's that sort of recognition that there's always a trade-off. So I
Mhm.
think that's the part we always have to understand is, there's a trade-off potentially in energy efficiency in one way, or air quality in another way, or moisture management, or, you know, people will talk about how high should plastic go. Well, the termite people will say one thing, and the people who are looking at thermal barriers will say another. And so I think there's a little bit of this. We've all got our blinders on sometimes, and we're only looking at it from the perspective of the shoes that we're in. And, it might be true in life in general. We kind of tend to do that. But like, I think if everyone would kind of step back and go, okay, well, if we make these changes, this may be better for this purpose, but we're going to have to give a little on this one. And I think just balancing out the pros and cons in all of these different things, I think is important. And ultimately, I think, what we're all really trying to do fundamentally is create the best solution for the home, create the best
Mhm.
solution for the
Hmm.
homeowner. And when we keep that front and center, everything else just kind of starts falling in place. That's sort of my philosophy.
So I wanted to ask one more thing. When we
That,
were talking about the business side,
mhm.
do you feel when offering your product, like a contractor, like it helps them win projects over their competitors?
Um, I think it depends on how it's positioned, if I'm honest. Like, I think it depends on how it's positioned. So I think that there are certainly a lot of contractors who can use this to be unique, right? They are
That's what
offering
I was thinking.
something different. And so they are looking at it in a different way. They're offering something different that the homeowner maybe hadn't thought of. I think it is important in those scenarios for that salesperson to know what they are pitching, because they're going to have to be able to explain it. So I think they have to a little bit remember back to that knowledge and passion. They've got to
Mhm.
understand it just enough to understand why they're offering an alternative of what the other five quotes might have been. But I think that if you get the homeowner who's like, okay, well, I really care about my house. Everything you're saying makes sense. You have now created a differentiated
Hmm.
solution that you are now not being compared just on price, because you've offered
Yeah.
something different. Okay. So I think the key is conveying the value that you are, providing to that homeowner is super important for that point of differentiation.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Because I'm sure, I haven't had the opportunity to deal with my crawl space, my
Yeah.
basement, my roof, my foundation yet. I'm still a new homeowner, right? But I know getting the same, like what feels like the same estimate from a bunch of different companies, makes the decision easier and harder at the same time. Most of the time, you're probably picking the first or the last. And if you actually have something that makes you different, you're gonna end up winning like some of those projects just because the other people can't offer what you're offering. So
Right. Right. Yeah. No. Good question.
Oh, that's fantastic. Well, Miriam, it's been absolutely incredible having you on as a guest today. Just in the short time that we had spoken to each other, at the World of Concrete, I was like, okay, She knows so much. She would be an incredible guest and just bring, different perspectives, because the goals are, how can we potentially help these contractors that are looking to diversify their businesses, potentially add additional services, bring more value to the homeowners. Everything you brought is incredibly insightful. Obviously, everyone can have their own opinions. That's the wonderful thing about, being a business owner or working, for a business and kind of trying new things. How can people learn more about Atmox or even get in touch with you?
Sure. Well, I think the first place to start, the easiest, is always our website, atmox.com, atmox.com. That's pretty easy. On there, you can find numerous, forms for finding an installer, finding a distributor. That's sort of the easiest way to get in touch with us, or email info@atmox.com. That will, come to a person pretty quickly, and it will route you to the right person depending on what your needs are. And then, for contractors, since that's your primary audience, we do sales training sessions, periodically. That's a good way to kind of learn a little bit more and just have a conversation with us. Like we are, only in the more recent time frame selling through distributors. So we're kind of used to being pretty hands-on with our installers. So we spend a lot of time talking to installers, even if they're not technically buying from us directly. So if you got this oddball crawl space where you're like, okay, I don't know what to do, we love those challenges. Think of it like little puzzles that we get to do of like, okay, how can we address this? You name it, you got a crawl space conversation, bring it. We love them.
Thank you so much. Before we wrap up the show, do you have any other, insights or anything that you'd like to share with the listeners?
Um, and I think we covered a lot. We covered a lot
Yes.
of different things, and some of it sometimes hard to absorb all in one sitting. So I appreciate that, if you made it to the end, that you've learned a lot, hopefully, in the course of this. I think the key takeaway is just sort of that, how you started with like the, this sort of debate. And I think I really want to emphasize that we're really not anti one or the other, right? It's just a recognition of a tool in your tool belt of how to tackle a crawl space project. And, we can be used in a whole wide variety of ways. And we're not really against encapsulation, and we're not against ventilation. We fit kind of in sort of a, like, let's just use common sense and let's figure out the best way to tackle this space. I guess, we're not anti whatever you're sitting in this, spectrum. We're kind of on your side.
Yeah, and I appreciate it. You really opened up my eyes. The explanations that you had were incredibly helpful. And, I sat on the side of, hey, we've got to seal it all up all the time. And that has really changed my perspective, because I think, knowledge is power. And the information that you were able to provide helps me to even understand, like, there's a smarter way of doing things. And, I'm always obviously looking for that. So, I'm optimistic that our listeners, take that into account as well.
So, Miriam, I think this has been a really interesting conversation. So, Mike and I, we're nerds. We like to nerd out, and I think you've helped us meet that bar today.
Yeah,
So,
I know it's always the danger we have. Sometimes we get a little too far in that sciencey stuff.
right. Well, crawl spaces are one of those parts of the home that most homeowners never see, right? And contractors, they know it has a huge impact on moisture control, structural health, and indoor air quality. And like we were saying at the beginning of the episode, there's a lot of strong opinions in this industry, especially. But it bleeds into so many industries when you're talking about crawl space. And everyone has their preferences on how things should be handled. Our goal today wasn't to settle that debate, and I don't think we did. Our goal was to introduce our listeners to another perspective, share some of the science behind how crawl space environments behave, and highlight some options contractors have not considered before. So I just want to thank you for taking the time to share your experience and your perspective and your education with Mike and I and our audience. And I'm really excited to see you again at Pest World in October.
Yeah. Well, thanks for having me. It's been fantastic to have this conversation.
All right, everybody. Well, thank you for listening to Contractors Edge. If you got value today, please make sure that you follow, like, and subscribe to the show on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, or wherever you're streaming on their platforms. Share this episode with another contractor you think could use the edge. For more tools, resources, and support, visit yourcontractorsedge.com. We'll be back soon with more tips, tools, and tactics to help you grow your business.